the difference between the freeze response and the fawn response, and how might it look different for your PDA child or teen and or for you? Okay, so today's my 42nd birthday, and so this is a little bit earlier coffee with Casey, but answering questions and teaching is probably my favorite thing. So here I am to celebrate my birthday with you. So the topic that I want to talk about today is a source of confusion for many parents. I'm seeing it in my DMs, I'm seeing it in the Paradigm Shift community. So I wanted to just kick off with a little bit of a clarification for you guys to help you understand the difference between freeze as a nervous system response and fawn as a nervous system response. So the way I understand it in polyvagal theory is that there's actually a sequence that bodies go through when there is a survival response. So Dr. Porges talks about like the first strategy often being social in nature before your body goes into full-on fight flight, and then it goes into freeze and then shut down. So freeze is like deer in the headlights, and there is like sympathetic activation, right? Like you're still having a little bit of fight flight, but you're also frozen. Whereas shutdown actually goes in a different direction where you're sort of immobilized and your metabolism is going to slow down. The blood that's been rushing through to your extremities in order to mobilize and arouse you to fight or flee is actually going to go to your center, so that like if you're the antelope and there's a lion and it bites your legs or arms, there's not going to be as much blood. Okay, so that's like the physiological steps. And part of this, what I want to explain, is important because for many of you as parents, and this I've experienced too, when you can't escape your situation with fight or flight, right? Like you guys, we can't fight or flee our children because it's our like most basic responsibility, and we would never harm a child. So many of us have gone into that freeze or shutdown state, but when you start to come out of it, you will move through fight flight in order to get back to what's called parasympathetic. Okay, so like when I've done a ton of healing work and nervous system work and worked with parents who are moving out of the disassociation and freeze and trauma cave, a lot of what feels like anger and agitation comes up as you move through that. Okay, so freeze is a combo state. It's a hybrid state of sympathetic activation of fight flight, but also immobilization. So what I like to think of it as deer in the headlights. And so what this will look like for your PDA child or teen is actually that they're not going to be trying to ingratiate themselves with authorities through social strategies, which is more fawn. They're just going to sort of be immobilized, right? So what this can look like in a classroom, for example, is a child who doesn't speak, a child who puts their head down on the desk, a child who seems dissociative, lethargic, looks out the window, maybe goes into a turtle shell. Or for a teen, you know, it's a little harder to discern because teens are more like this, but just like non-responsive, distracted in their own thoughts, sort of glazed look in their eye, head on the desk, or totally disassociated, okay? So that's like a freeze response, and it's very similar to what masking looks like in the PDA space of internalizing the threat response, or the perception from the neuroception, the survival brain, that actually I can't let out my fight flight. This is a subconscious perception. I can't let out my fight flight because it's actually not safe, so I'm going to go more into freeze. That's what the brain is telling the body. Okay? Whereas fawning is more social strategies in order to get safety by ingratiating oneself with the perceived authority. Okay? So like freeze, like fight or flight, it's a reflexive autonomic response. And it might look like a child or a teen focusing on whether it's the most popular person in a setting or the teacher or someone they perceive as having authority who's not safe, they might be unwilling to say no, unwilling to share their true preferences, hide their true preferences, and really try and help or ingratiate themselves to the authority. So those two things, freeze and fawn, are going to look very different, but because they're not fight or flight, parents often look at them as similar. So I just want to discern between those, and I also want to talk about it from the perspective of a parent, because I've worked now with hundreds of parents, many of whom are moms, and a lot of moms in this community have a fawn response, and many of them are either like highly sensitive nervous system, anxious, potentially a history of childhood trauma, potentially from an undiagnosed parent with neurodivergence, or they're PDA themselves, but because they've been a perfectionist, people pleaser, fawn response, that they've never recognized it in themselves. And so I actually, not because I'm PDA, but because of my own stuff, have a fawn response that I've been working on for years, which looks like automatic yes all the time, right? No boundaries, or like seeking out the person who I need to ingratiate myself with in order to feel safe in a certain social setting. Okay, so for example, how does this play out for my life right now? The reason I have an admin and automatic responses on my emails is because my nervous system response is automatic yes. Like, no matter what you ask me, I'm going to say yes, because I am so uncomfortable with the potential for someone getting upset with me that I actually have like a nervous system response, right? A dagger in my heart. So like the work has been, and sometimes I work with parents on this, is like, it's literally just like taking a pause before you respond as one of the, like, awareness of like what's going on. Like, why are you constantly saying yes to things that aren't actually serving you? But like, imagine if I, Casey, with 37,000 followers, continued that pattern of like every time someone in my DM writes me a million questions, I sit there and have a fawn response and fill it out for like 10 paragraphs, which I have done in the past, right? What happens? It ends up burning me out, filling me with resentment and shutting me down, and then I go into freeze. I'm just using an example from my own life because I know how many moms out there especially have a fawn response. It may be related to a different root cause than mine. Maybe you're PDA, but this is like an important nervous system response to understand. Okay, so social strategies and fawn often come preceding fight, flight. Then we go into freeze, which is a hybrid state. Then we go into full-on shutdown, which is like the antelope playing dead because lions don't eat dead prey. Okay, so we talked a little bit about like, how does this apply to your kid? How does this apply to you? I'd love to hear in the chat or the comments if any of you feel that you have a fawn response. It doesn't get talked about quite as much because it does get talked about a lot in the like people-pleasing, high-functioning, codependency, empath space. But in terms of PDA, identifying parents, it often comes a little later. Additionally, like, we often recognize PDA much sooner with a fight flight because it's very externalized and we can see it. It looks like oppositional, defiant, or violent behavior. Okay, I see lots of happy birthdays. Thank you. So nice. Teresa says, happy birthday, thank you. Just dropped my 3-year-old off to school with dreads in her hair. Love it. Feeling extra grateful to have access to your expertise. Wonderful. You are so welcome here. When I was a kid, I would faint when my parents made intense demands of me, and now I feel myself freeze at mundane daily tasks. Could this be internalized PDA? Sure. I mean, absolutely. But here's how I think about it, and this is what I would encourage you to think about. So I always want to discern the root cause of what's activating that freeze response. So for example, if your parents, let's just take two scenarios because I don't know you and I don't want you to necessarily have to put out all your childhood stuff on a live, but let's take two scenarios. Let's say like you're growing up in a household where one of your parents was undiagnosed PDA. Maybe they had a more internalized or externalized expression. But you didn't know that, right? And so there was a lot of fluctuation in terms of their moods, or their regulation, and it seemed unpredictable when you would get particular responses, which may have just been their fight-flight response or equalizing against you as a safe person in the home. Like, let's say that's your experience and you were not PDA, but you developed hypervigilance in order to keep yourself safe as a trauma response from that childhood experience, and then the trigger could have been intense demands because you anticipated that uncertainty of like, if I don't do it correctly or if I don't do it the way they want, perfectionism, then there's going to be this big blowout that I can't predict. Okay, so that's, you may still have a trauma response from your childhood experience without being neurodivergent or with being neurodivergent, because if you're neurodivergent of any sort, you're going to be more susceptible to that sensitivity. Okay, but if your root cause of when you get activated is evocative cues from your past, from your childhood, rather than your neurotype, you can still have that nervous system response of freeze. Let's take the other scenario. Let's say, these are just like archetypical scenarios, so take the information and the logic and generalize it to your situation. Let's say you are a PDA child and you don't know it and nobody knows it, and your parents might be neurotypical or not PDA, and maybe they're pretty consistent in their parenting, but they're more traditional parents, and the root cause is not evocative cues from your childhood and their dysregulation in the environment, but rather every time your brain perceives a loss of autonomy and equality, right? So if they're doing traditional parenting, it's going to accumulate in your system, and there's going to be that tipping point of the straw, which would be an intense demand, and then you're going to go into freeze because you perceive no ability to fight or flight as a child, right? And then that's going to be overlaid with trauma on top of that. So the reason I point this out is because, like, I have a very sensitive threat response, and so I totally understand the mechanisms, but what's different about me from a parent I'm working with who is PDA by neurotype is that it's not, the root cause is not related to my perception of autonomy and equality. It's related to like perfectionism and needing to make sure my environment is certain in order to stay safe. So I hope this is making sense, because often these two archetypes, or anywhere in between them, characterize or describe the parents that are in my world, right? So when I'm in like a program, I'll always say, for example, the fifth module of the Paradigm Shift program is all about creating safety outside of the home and advocacy, but really it's about you. And we talk about why it's so hard to set boundaries, why it's so hard to communicate your needs, why you're going to have triggers and trauma responses when you're trying to advocate and create safety outside of the home. And it's because usually parents fall on like highly anxious all the way to PDA themselves and everywhere in between. And we don't, you know, it's genetic. And so it like, even if you're not PDA, maybe your spouse is, or maybe your sibling is, or maybe a parent or a grandparent is. And so there's all these family dynamics that interweave and lead to sensitive nervous systems, whether it's genetic or experiential or a combination of the two. So thanks, Mom. Happy birthday to me. So that is a very long-winded answer to your question. But I really like to clarify, like, let's take the root and neuroception, which can be different, but it can cause the same nervous system mechanisms. And that's why it can be so hard to pull apart trauma, neurotype, etc. Okay. Hello, everybody. Thanks for the waves. Okay, as a kid, I used to faint when my parents were even lightly angry with me. Could it be the demand of conflict made me freeze? Okay, so Jasmine May, so only you can discern what the root cause is, right? Like from what I just described. So it's a process of hopefully me giving you like breadcrumbs of clarity and then you following your intuition of like, oh, I think the reason was X, because I can never like tell someone what their lived experience is. PDA, child, fight, flight, externalized, high masking, and I'm fawn response. Yeah, absolutely. You're welcome. Yes, but I feel like girls are raised to be fawns. However, I'm not sure if I'm PDA, as my childhood could really explain a lot. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that our modern society conditions women to have a fawn response. But I think it intersects with neurotype, neurology, mental health, childhood. Yeah, I mean, it's complicated to parse. And that would be like something we would do in a coaching container, which is why I like can't really do it here. But yeah, there's a lot going on. How do we deal with trying to get the school to understand everything you are saying? Tried to present medical info, but teachers always just think they know better. Yeah, so like what I teach in terms of schools is like, I really encourage parents to focus on nonviolent requests that are specific to their child's access needs of like, I'd like to make a request that, you know, when the child has to go to the bathroom, they can use this like red card instead of having to make a verbal request, and then they can just go to the bathroom for a break, right? So it's like very specific instead of like, let me teach you everything about PDA, because then we're in the convincing energy, and then there's like a counter argument, which is like, well, this isn't in the DSM-5, and, you know, we only use evidence-based strategies, which is behavioral approaches, et cetera, et cetera. So that's just a nugget to take away of, like, moving from convincing or teaching about PDA and moving into making specific requests for your child's needs. Because really, honestly, they don't have to fully understand, everything that like we're talking about here. They just need to understand what your child needs. Yeah. And I'm sorry you're dealing with that. It's really stressful. I am Louise. My own now healing fawn response comes from childhood trauma plus undiagnosed neurodivergence, autism, ADHD, and probable internalized PDA. It's a lot to handle, but proud to break intergenerational trauma. You're doing it! So cool. I read somewhere PDA could be caused by trauma. Yeah, that's not something that I feel I can speak to with confidence. I think where we want to be careful is like causality versus correlation, right? So like a lot of people think like something happened that was traumatic that therefore caused PDA. And so the cause is the trauma and the outcome is the PDA, whereas PDA might have existed before, which made the child more susceptible to trauma and then exacerbated the already sensitive nervous system and neuroception. I believe it's a neurotype. I believe I believe it's from birth. That's my perspective. I think it can be exacerbated by trauma. An interesting conversation I've had with a medical doctor who identifies as autistic is like patterns I've seen among moms who actually have like traumatic birth and pregnancy experiences, and potentially their PDA infant being neurodivergent genetically in the womb and being more susceptible to trauma, which wires their nervous system differently. However, I don't know why it would relate so strongly and specifically to autonomy and equality, because that's like the root cause of PDA. Anyways, I'm just like talking about my perspective, but my key perspective is that it is a neurotype, it's genetic, and a child is born with it. Yes, you can have a regression. Yes, you can, not a regression, you can have like what looks like a regression or looks like onset later. But what I believe this is actually the accumulation of continual nervous system activation until it passes the threshold continuously to reach trauma and nervous system burnout, which is when many parents see it, including myself. Can a nonverbal child be PDA? I signed up for a masterclass, but this is where I get confused. So I've had a fair amount of parents of non-speaking children in my programs. But what I always say when people ask about this is like, you have to discern according to the logic, right? So the logic is a survival drive for autonomy that consistently overrides other survival instincts: eating, sleeping, toileting, safety. Equalizing behavior that has nothing to do with words, right? Like behaviors of like, you try and set a limit and they immediately go over and destroy something of yours. Fluctuating nature. So at times it seems like your child doesn't have a nervous system disability and other times it does. Masking might not apply as much here, but I think there's also nonverbal signs of masking, right? Behaviors looking very different in two different contexts. And then the constant need for undivided attention, signals of nervous system safety, and co-regulation, which is like the inability to play independently or engage independently without you sort of entertaining them or engaging. So those are the 5 things I look for and I talked about in that masterclass. But yes, I used a lot of examples that were more verbal in nature, but then as a parent, the task becomes always, regardless of if your child is non-speaking or speaking, is to follow that logic and observe the indicators with your own 2 eyes to say, and follow your intuition, like, yes, this neurotype fits my child. And if you're not sure, what I encourage parents to do is to start, experimenting with accommodations, which really a lot of them have nothing to do with verbal communication except potentially declarative language. But like, you know, things like providing autonomy, equality, humor, nervous system safety, all of those things we can experiment with without, you know, relying on a verbal response. In fact, much of it is based on nonverbal signals of safety. And so then when you experiment, you can observe the data of like, is my kid's basic needs improving? Is their connection to me improving? The indicators I look for are also nonverbal. They're like, did my son stick his feet under my legs today and cozy up to me on the couch? Or was he like, when I sat next to him, right? And he's very articulate, but much of the indicators I look for are nonverbal in nature, because this is really going on at a nervous system and subconscious level. So, you know, my son never talks to me about his internal experience of like, I think this is going on. I really had to discern it from the outside looking in, and he stopped talking when he was in nervous system burnout. Anyways, I hope that's helpful to you. So whenever I use examples, they're based on a foundational logic that doesn't change, whether your child is 3 or 33. And I've had that range of ages in my world, right? And some kids are going to have, you know, PANS, PANDAS, and PDA, or, you know, they're adopted and have a history of trauma and PDA, right? And so, or they're going to be non-speaking and use assisted communication devices. So that's when the parents have to lead this. And that's true for all of us, because most of the time we can't find practitioners who understand it as well as you do. All right, my friends, I'm going to jump off because I'm going to a yoga class to celebrate my 42 years. I thank you for being here to celebrate and be live with me on my B-Day. And I'll see you here soon. Okay, bye.